Oh, you're slick. You investors in hate. You Saddams and you Bushes. You Bin Ladens and snakes. You billionaire bullies. You're a globalized curse. You put war on the masses and then you clean out the purse.
Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, April 7th, 2022, and we are coming to you live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. Good morning, I'm Mary Massey, and with me is co-host John SAKOWICZ. Hello, John.
Good morning, Mary, and a quick hello to two birthday boys out there. Matthew Ho, who's been a frequent guest on our show, decorated war hero in Afghanistan, Marine Corps company commander, and now a leading peace activist. Happy birthday, brother. We love you. And also to Francis Ford Coppola, who we're going to try to get on our show. Francis, as most of you know, lives in Northern California, less commonly known as the fact that he sold all his holdings, all his wineries, his restaurants, his resorts, and he's financing his magnum opus, the last movie of his life. It's going to be called Megalopolis. It's a kind of Stanley Kubrick sequel to Apocalypse Now, about just a utopian world. And we look forward to having Francis Ford Coppola on the show soon.
Thank you, John. Today's program and all programs are archived right here at kmud.org, our Facebook page, Heroes and Patriots, and our program website, heroespatriots.org. You have the opportunity to speak with our guest today by calling 707-923-9311. That is the studio. And we have help today from our engineer sitting in, Javi. Thank you, Javi, for joining us and for engineering the program. Today we have a guest for the next hour, Norman Solomon. Norman Solomon is an American journalist, media critic, activist, and former U.S. congressional candidate. He is a longtime associate of the Media Watch group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR. In 1997, he founded the Institute for Public Accuracy, which works to provide alternate sources for journalists and serves as its executive director. In 2012, Solomon ran for Congress in California's 2nd Congressional District. He attended both the 2016 and 2020 Democratic Convention as a representative for Bernie Sanders. Good morning, Norman. We know you're with us. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning, Mary. Good morning, John.
Wonderful.
Good morning, Norman. We love having you on the show, brother. It's we try to get you on at least once a year, if not more often. You really are truly one of the leading progressive voices in America today, and just a super effective activist. Thank you for being on the show.
So, Norman, in past programs, John and I have examined the invasion of Ukraine by Putin with respect to nuclear war being made more possible, use of cluster bombs illegally on citizens, and Israelis lack to condemn Putin outright. They've been very slow to do so. As a member of RootsAction.org, or the director, I should say, could you just comment or weigh in on those items and other things from your own perspective?
Well, RootsAction.org is very multi-issue. I should say we started out 10 years ago with 0 online supporters. We now have 1.2 million, including many, many thousands in Northern California, along the coast here. So it's very important that we all keep organizing in various fields. Within a couple of hours after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Roots Action issued a statement condemning it unequivocally. We're opposed to militarism by any country, and the use of weaponry and troops to invade another country, just absolutely unacceptable. And so for us, and I think for so many people around the country and the world, it's just a horrific set of events, as was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, as was the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. A new element is that this is a face-off essentially between two nuclear superpowers. And between them, Washington and Moscow control more than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So that's something that we are not hearing much about from the mass media. And I'm glad we can talk about this today because there are many cross currents. There's a lot of rigidity and one might say a fair amount of confusion among progressives and others about what this terrible war in Ukraine means.
John, did you have something else that you want to say in the beginning?
Well, I'm glad we kicked off with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We're going to try to have our engineer get Norman back on the air. I don't know whether he's on Skype or not. But last night I was talking with Dan Huffman, who is the very distinguished retired CIA station chief. He was the CIA's director of the Middle East and North African divisions. And his great fear is that Russia will fall back on what he calls a scorched earth policy, that Plan B, not being able to overrun the Ukraine in 1 week. Putin's plan is now just to simply destroy the country, and bringing the country back to a level of devastation that hasn't been seen since World War II.
Well, I was saying that Roots Action from the very beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine condemned the invasion in no uncertain terms. We have vigorously opposed what Russia is doing in Ukraine, as we vigorously opposed what the United States has been doing in Afghanistan and Iraq in the last decade and longer. This is a real need for a single standard of human rights, a single standard against militarism and war. And unfortunately, while that should be self-evident, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of confusion and some contradiction among people who are just so susceptible to propaganda coming from corporate mass media that they want to make exceptions about militarism and war rather than being consistent.
Right.
So what's the answer, Norman? How do we enforce laws against war crimes and crimes against humanity? How effective is The Hague and the International Court in prosecuting these crimes? And why don't more American war crimes find their way to that court?
Well, the U.S. government has never recognized or been part of the International Criminal Court, and it's very much a stance, do as we say, not as we do. The United States opposes prosecution of certain countries and leaders, but the last thing they want to do, meaning the leaders of the U.S. government of both parties, is to be susceptible to charges of war crimes in The Hague or anywhere else. So they don't want to stand in a dock, and they don't want their... Frankly, if you look at the behavior and actions of President George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, or now, alas, even Mr. Biden, there would certainly be grounds for prosecution of war crimes. I don't say that lightly. Say, when you're sending drones into countries and targeting people and killing them, and most of them, according to the available evidence dug up in reporting by The Intercept and elsewhere, are civilians. These are basically wars of aggression. They're not defense wars. And so what are the restraints? I think, John, that's a great question. The restraints are the people of the world, the people of the country, the people here of the United States. To the extent we can restrain and constrain the warfare state, that is where the hope is. And necessary, while not sufficient, is information, education, agitation, and organizing. And so even though any of us and our projects have reason to feel small and perhaps ineffectual, it's the aggregate and the combination that makes it possible. This radio program, other radio programs, television efforts, email, websites, all sorts of different efforts have an aggregate effect to help to change a climate that now prevails, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it, the madness of militarism is with us very well. And while Russia's war on Ukraine is horrific and must be condemned in no uncertain terms, the United States maintains a so-called war on terror, which for many people has been and continues to be even experienced a war of terror with drones overhead, with other aspects of warfare on them and their communities. That's just reality, and it's best if we face it rather than simply get into a Manichaean view of the world. There's a good side and a bad side when both sides are engaged in warfare.
And let's not forget Israel's own war crimes. Numerous, massive violations of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, countless aggressions, the annexation of the Golan Heights, the annexation of East Jerusalem, and other Palestinian territories, shooting civilians, shooting children, just numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity. We had Richard Silverstein on the show last week, and we spoke to that point.
Well, we're more than 50 years into an illegitimate occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by Israel. There was a terrible irony reported in the irony-free zone of U.S. corporate media, which includes NPR and PBS, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, PBS NewsHour, that Israel, the Israeli government, is denouncing the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Well, of course, we should all denounce it, just as we should denounce the more than 50 years of occupation and suppression of the human rights of Palestinian people by Israel. These are some realities. And then when we get over to the political realm, we have some courageous members of Congress who have been speaking out about, with more than $3 billion with a B dollars a year in military aid guaranteed from the United States government in a 10-year pact, unprecedented $38 billion promised over 10 years from the United States. The Israeli government continuing to, as you allude to, John, with impunity suppress the rights, periodically bomb Gaza. Most of the victims overwhelmingly are civilians, and many of them children, disproportionately by sometimes ratio of 50 or 100 to 1, the Palestinian deaths compared to Israeli deaths. And you get to Congress, and you have Betty McCollum, a congresswoman from Minnesota, who has a bill that the U.S. should cut off any money that is used by the Israeli government, and there's quite a lot of it being used to suppress, imprison even children and others in military attacks that maim and kill children. And in the last year or so, the number of co-sponsors has gone from about 14 to, the last time I checked, about 30. So that's only less than 10% of the House of Representatives, but it is an increase, and we need to keep pushing. And to his credit, Congressperson Jared Huffman eventually signed on as a co-sponsor. He's been spotty on Palestinian rights, sometimes good, sometimes absolutely not good, and he continues to sign on to some pretty bad legislation having to do with Israel. And yet, because of pressure, because people in Mendocino and Humboldt and Sonoma and Marin counties in this district have pressured and pushed, he's budged a bit. And I think that's necessary around the country on so many issues, because if we leave it to the hierarchy of the Democratic Party, and I am on the Central Committee of the California State Democratic Party, if we leave it to the National Democratic Party to, from the top, fight for human rights, quite often it ain't going to happen. Just let me mention that the horrific, and this is truly a genocidal war, led by Saudi Arabia against the people of Yemen, 250,000 people killed already, children dying from malnutrition because of the blockade, the United States continuing to arm and provide intelligence for the Saudi government to bomb and slaughter people in Saudi Arabia. We still can't get a bill through Congress to stick in the Biden era so that we can stop that. And we've got this petro-ally, Saudi Arabia, that is perpetrating these crimes on a daily basis. That tells you how far we have to go.
Norman, speaking of Congressman Jared Huffman, how do you think he's doing? And also comment, if you will, about the Democratic Party is not one monolithic thing. You know, you have progressives, wonderful progressives, probably led by Bernie Sanders, but you have blue dog Democrats like Mike Thompson, if you can explain what that is to our audience, and then what I want to call corporate Democrats like Jared Hoffman. They go along with the Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic Party machine, and to get them to do some of the things that you just mentioned, that would be part of the aggressive agenda, he literally has to be pried away from that Democratic Party machine. So how's Jared doing? And then just go into kind of like the fractious nature of the Democratic Party itself.
Yes, well, Jared Huffman, now almost 10 years into being a congressperson from our district, and as you noted, I did run in the open primary against him back in 2012.
Wow.
He's done a bit better than I expected, not nearly as good as what we need. He tends to fluctuate. He usually votes what we would, as progressives, call good votes, but he's not in a leadership position in his own articulation. I'm not talking about a post that he would hold. I'm talking about his willingness to fight in an affirmative, positive, humanistic way for basic programs and speaking out. He supports Medicare for all, but you won't hear him extremely vocal. He has not really been in the forefront of opposing U.S. militarism, although he usually votes against militaristic budgets, but not always. And so it's, a glass part full. And as you refer to I believe to the extent he has improved over what we might have expected, it's because of pressure from people in the communities. He's in a fairly safe seat, and yet members of Congress are always concerned that someone might come out off stage onto the stage, like what happened to Congressman Engel, who was defeated by Jamal Bowman a few years ago. Engel, a very powerful chair of, as I remember, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, defeated and shocked because a grassroots candidate came out of the blue from grassroots support and defeated. So that pressure, anyway, against Jared Huffman, very important. We shouldn't be just grateful for what is good and he's doing. We should demand that he be much, much better because the need is greatly there. Overall, I agree with you. There are, avowedly militaristic corporate Democrats. Then there are sort of corporate Democrats light, which is still very heavy. They simply adhere to, with rare exceptions, what Nancy Pelosi, as the party leader in the House and the Speaker, wants. And so we have this real contrast. We have Bernie Sanders in the Senate. We have Ilhan Omar. We have Rashida Tlaib. These are wonderful, but all too rarely wonderful members of Congress who need to be supported. Corporate Democrats are always trying to unseat them. Hakeem Jeffries, as not exactly a blue dog, but a Democratic Party leader in the House, has set up a PAC against Democratic Party challengers. And that's how we got Cori Bush out of the St. Louis area into Congress. We get these few great members of Congress because they're willing to challenge sitting members of Congress or fight like hell in an open seat, which very rarely does occur. So here in California, I can be very blunt with you. The California Democratic Party now has the worst leadership, certainly in the 12 years that I've almost continuously been on the State Central Committee of the State Democratic Party. Rusty Hicks is just think Tammany Hall, just think Mayor Daley in the Chicago days of old. We have a very autocratically run Democratic Party that really breaks the rules whenever it wants to, will take fossil fuel money, really does not adhere to basic lowercase d democratic principles. So as always, I think we need to organize effectively. How do we get a member of the Assembly like Jim Wood? I mean, really, it's disgraceful that a progressive Assembly district on the whole, I'm not saying it's a hugely left-wing district, but the Assembly district that Jim Wood represents deserves much better. But we're not going to get much better. We're not going to get much better anywhere until and unless, or to the extent that people organize effectively, including in the electoral realm. It's tedious, but it's work that has to be done.
It's 23 minutes past the hour. Norman, we have a caller for you on the line. Caller, go ahead with your brief question.
Good morning. My name is Mark Herbert. I'm a constituent here in Mendocino County. I want to thank this program for being one of the lighting hearts of true journalism in the darkness these days. Mr. Solomon, thank you very much for your dutiful service for the people of the state of California and the Great Republic. My question is simple. I have contacted both Assemblymember Wood and Jared Huffman's office numerous times in relation to a RICO indictment passed down by the FBI last calendar year alleging an operation of Tom Allman, former sheriff of Mendocino County, his undersheriff, which was a made-up opportunity for Randy Johnson to avoid conviction for his crimes in Redwood Valley for cannabis growth while he was the head of task force for cannabis in Mendocino County, as well as the seated and still sitting district attorney, David Eister. There's been little to no press in this district. One mentioned nationally because I kept hounding the national news cycles. Could you please comment on why, first and foremost, we have a district attorney who's still in office today, conducting business as usual, which is allegedly criminal, as well as little to no information for the constituency of this area for the grave embarrassment that law enforcement has brought over the people of this area. Thank you, and I continue to support your candidacy should you choose to run again. Have a wonderful day. Peace. Let's repair the republic.
Thank you, caller.
First, thank you for your comments about me. I appreciate it. And I can't say anything about an issue and a situation about which I know nothing. And so I appreciate that you've brought it up and shared your information and perspective, but I just can't comment it because I'm not well informed about it at all. I'm not informed about it. And I have to say that on so many concerns that people have, media are absolutely crucial. And I'm very familiar with what has happened to the Press Democrat daily newspaper, and it's just appalling. It has gone from mediocre to worse to very worse. You can trace it to the ownership shifts in the last decade and more. And so this is what we're up against. I mean, we can read the Anderson Valley Advertiser. We can tear our hair out at some of it we don't like. We can appreciate very much what we do like. The point is that there's a lot more openness in certain smaller media outlets than there are from the big ones. And, you know, you're listening to a program now that provides huge service to people who are often understandably frustrated by effectively blockades through corporate media of information and analysis. So this is an ongoing challenge.
Norman, I will write to you off air about what Mark Herbert was speaking of. There's a huge RICO investigation going on right now in Mendocino County. 2 Roanoke Park police officers have already been sentenced in shaking down cannabis growers. It's of course, they couldn't have been operating up here in Mendocino County without being part of a larger conspiracy of local law enforcement here in our county. It's a huge issue. It's been underreported, and I'll bring you up to speed, offline. It's interesting that you mentioned the Anderson Valley Advertiser.
No, Press Democrat.
Yeah, I'm a subscriber. I love Bruce and Mark Scaramella. Here in our county, they do just hard-hitting reporting. In Humboldt County, redheaded black belt, Kyle Kemp, Kim Kemp, just a wonderful reporter. Let's talk about journalism. What to do about hedge funds and journalism? I know there's a fundraiser coming up and a panel discussion for Rick Goldsmith's film in progress, Stripped of Its Parts. How have hedge funds just kind of just taken over American journalism, and what are the consequences for just having this great corporatization of national media?
Well, as you mentioned, there's a film in progress, a documentary work by Rick Goldsmith, who co-produced and directed, along with Judith Ehrlich, the film The Most Dangerous Man in America, about Daniel Ellsberg, the great Pentagon Papers whistleblower and for 50 years anti-war peace activist, Daniel Ellsberg. And Rick Goldsmith also did a wonderful film, which you can find, I believe, online, called Tell the Truth and Run. Tell the Truth and Run being the title, about the great press critic George Seldes, and that's definitely worth looking up. Overall, it's hedge funds and big corporate ownership that has done so much damage. And I was talking about the Press Democrat. It was just a bunch of rich people getting together trying to buy the press. As A.J. Liebling said, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. And you can see the corruption and the failure to investigate or report on the environmental damage in our region from the wine industry, the tremendous damage being done to the lives of farm workers by corporate greed, so many other ways in which it's the big money that calls the tune that we're told to dance to. And so whether we talk about local journalism or national or global, even though the internet has been a boon to independent efforts, it also has been a boon to corporate media. And when you look at the biggest reach coming from news and information sources in the United States, to people in the United States, they're all corporate owned by huge conglomerates. And if they aren't to begin with, they are soon, because that is the nature of the big fish gobbling up the small fish. You know, there's a lot of talk about disaster capitalism. You don't need both words. You can just say capitalism. This is the process. This is the process of whenever there's an opening, whether it's from a war or some kind of devastation or simply market trends, there are big concentrations of capital that will come in and try to tilt things for more of their profits. So for journalism, it's really a challenge, a fight from the bottom up against what's coming from the top down. And we have wonderful journalists out of many outlets. Maybe they're tiny, maybe they're small, maybe they're sizable. Online, I certainly, for national news and information, I go to a place where I occasionally write for, commondreams.org. There are many other places that intrepid, hardworking people, often on a shoestring, are doing the kind of journalism that we desperately need. And I do want to say that although there are some glimmers of what I think is enterprise and good reporting, especially on foreign policy, when you get beyond the shores of the United States in terms of the focus of reporting, what we're getting from programs like NPR's All Things Considered and Morning Edition, it's really appalling. You're getting essentially official views of the world. The sourcing is from people who accept the prerogative of the U.S. government to work its way on the world, pseudo-diplomatically, economically, and militarily. Very little diversity in perspectives, but this is the apocryphal, perhaps, tale of the frog being boiled a degree at a time. 50 years ago when it started, All Things Considered was a program with a lot of reportorial independence. Now it's corporate media, and we have to redouble our efforts to provide alternatives.
It's 32 minutes past the hour. If you've just tuned into the program, this is Heroes and Patriots, and we are speaking with Norman Solomon, an American journalist, media critic, activist, and former U.S. congressional candidate. We have another caller for you, Norman. We'd like to take that now if we can.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this very important show. Mr. Solomon, I wanted to connect what you've been saying to the earlier part of this show where you talked about the warfare state and organizing from the grassroots up to try to bring about a different perspective for starting in this country. And today, in at least in the New York Times, there was this awful article about a collection of high-wealth donors, the Rockbridge Group, that's organizing very effectively to do grassroots organizing for the most right-wing part of the Republican Party. I would really appreciate your perspective as to how the Democrats are going to actually really focus, given everything you've been saying now, on getting those grassroots voters to vote for continue, at least for a different makeup of Congress that is not going to succumb to the efforts of the Rockbridge Group?
Yes, thank you for your question and your comments. Such a challenge. We are in this two-party system, and when you look at how it's set up, that is the way it's going to go. It's a fantasy to think that in the structure of the United States, we're going to be able to effectively, in partisan races, I'm not talking about municipal races or county races, I'm talking about partisan races where the party affiliation is listed on the ballot next to the candidate's name. We're stuck with two parties. That's just reality. It's not the same structure as in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, for instance. And so that makes all the more important, I think, our clarity as best we can of similarities and differences between the Democratic and Republican parties. When you look at who is on the Supreme Court and the party of the president who put that person, nominated that person to be on the Supreme Court, it is preposterous when people say that there's no difference between the Democratic and Republican Party. It's the right-wing worst members of the Supreme Court were nominated by Republican presidents. Likewise, more than ever, the Republican Party is the party of white supremacy. And the contempt for democracy is not just about January 6th, it's ongoing. This is an anti-democratic, neo-fascist party called the Republican Party. So we need to be clear about that. And the differences between, for instance, climate denial, which continues to be the line of the Republican Party, and at least acknowledgement, as in terribly inadequate as the actions are, acknowledgement of the climate emergency from the Democratic Party, that is, again, one of many, many differences. And certainly the racism of the Republican Party alone is a huge distinction with the Democratic Party, its failings and limitations notwithstanding. When you go beyond the water's edge, when you go to foreign policy, with the exception of climate, essentially you have very little difference between the Republican and Democratic parties. And Republicans are a bit crazier, but both parties embrace these huge, bloated U.S. military budgets. When Biden in his first year proposed a budget 1.6% higher than Trump's bloated budget, Republicans led the charge and Democrats went along with it to increase the military budget, the squandered and not really defense lowercase d budget, even more. And so that is a lot of our challenge, is to deal with now the frenzy that is going on to exploit the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine to boost U.S. militarism even more. And clarity for us, and I think as you said, as the caller said quite correctly, we have to do grassroots work to educate and agitate and insist that not only we understand and study and speak out against U.S. militarism, but we insist that members of Congress who ostensibly represent us are going to put the brake on this momentum, which in the case of confrontation with Russia is heading towards nuclear confrontation.
Right. We're going to take a brief pause, Norman, so we can catch our breath and then return after this brief musical interlude.
We're back with Norman Solomon, a friend of our station and a friend of independent media. Norman just mentioned NPR and how it has evolved over the years just to be another voice for corporate America. Norman, if you will, speak to us about the differences in, like, say, public radio and stations like ours, KMUD, what I call community radio. Tell us the difference between NPR affiliates and, say, Pacifica affiliates, and shows like ours and Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! and Tom Hartman's show, and what you're more likely to find on more mainstream public radio, and why the differences are important.
A lot of the distinction has to go with the reliance on sources. Who are the sources that we hear from, as well as the perspective of the reporters and the announcers and so forth. And when the sources, and there's certainly many of them available, are within a framework that accept tacitly, with some divergence of opinions, corporate power, the legitimacy of corporations to maximize profits no matter what it, or largely no matter what it does to public health and the environment and well-being. When there's an acceptance, as we were just talking about, of U.S. foreign policy implicitly without much dissent even allowed on the airwaves, that's part and parcel what we are getting, with very rare exceptions, from an outlet like All Things Considered or Morning Edition or the PBS NewsHour. Community radio, while we always need vigilance, community radio has the potential that's often largely fulfilled to bring in other voices. And sometimes we get from people, well, you're a community radio station, you're biased, you only let on progressive. And for one thing, there are quite a few community radio stations who will pipe in All Things Considered or Morning Edition. And perhaps they should. I think largely they probably should not. But more to the point, All Things Considered and Morning Edition are each heard by millions of people. You can hardly drive out of the range of that NPR News menu. Whereas we have the precious airtime of community radio stations. So should we dilute that by simply replicating what is so powerfully available on the line or and on the air, or should we devote our precious airtime to supplementing it, which I think is what is needed and what is good when community radio does its work? I think quite often the most valuable work is local issues, because the collapse of daily newspapers in many communities, and even weekly newspapers, not that they were all great shakes, but sometimes they really provided valuable services, and they have been disappearing at a tremendous rate. So you have communities that used to have one or even two daily newspapers or two or three weekly papers. They're often reduced to one or even zero, and so local coverage just doesn't exist. If you have corruption on the Board of Supervisors or in agencies of the county, it just doesn't get covered, or doesn't get covered well. So I think community radio can really provide a service as well as supplement and augment what is so limited coming from national media about national and international affairs.
We have a question that was sent in by a listener, and the question is this: is there a growing movement of censorship? For example, YouTube deleting videos of Chris Hedges as a result of different perspective of Putin. Would you care to comment?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a very important question. I mean, the whole framework of corporate media is, by another name, censorship. So I'm certainly against the way that YouTube canceled Chris Hedges, as I understand it, or I guess it to be. That has to do with RT, that RT was shut down, formerly known as Russia Today, essentially owned by the Russian government. Right. And Chris Hedges had a show on there. And so in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been this purging of programs, which is just, it's Orwellian and it's wrong. I think when we step back, we could say that programs and perspectives by any other name are censored and excluded, not just by CBS, NBC, ABC, but by NPR and PBS. Mm-hmm. And so we don't call it that, but how many times have you heard Noam Chomsky on All Things Considered or Morning Edition?
Yeah.
I think the number in the last 20 or 30 years is like once or twice.
Right.
He's been heard all over the world in mass media, but not in the United States. And we can have many other examples. So I think that tells us a lot about the mechanisms, by any other name, of censorship in this country. The right wing has huge assets to not just Fox News, but even television cable networks to the right of Fox News, reaching millions of viewers every day because they have billionaire backers. And the same goes for corporate-backed media, centrist and mildly liberal outlets. We do not have that on the left among progressives. That's why we have to be as scrappy and creative as possible to reach more people.
Right.
You know, I had the same conversation with Daniel Ellsberg, and he, you know, the exact same conversation.
Right.
Norm Chauncey, Daniel Ellsberg, Cynthia McKinney.
Yeah.
You know, these are powerful, powerful voices. Why don't we hear more from them?
Norman?
We have this experience, and you mentioned I'm founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. We send out a couple of hundred news releases a year to about 10,000 producers, editors, reporters. It's very difficult to get progressive voices, even when they're timely, historic figures like Daniel Ellsberg. It's difficult to get them into anything approximating mainstream media, and yet we have to keep trying. And before I forget, I'd like to mention briefly here a couple of organizations that I'm part of that people are invited to go to the web and sign up for alerts. One is at the Institute for Public Accuracy. Whether you're a producer or not, you can get almost daily updates with perspectives and analysis on breaking news. And that, just go to the web at accuracy.org. That's accuracy.org. And I work with colleagues at rootsaction.org. We referred to that earlier on in the hour. And if you're not on the alert email list for Roots Action, I hope you will sign up. We now have more than 1 million people, as I mentioned, and it's through our united efforts that we can have impact. So I invite everybody to the web, go to rootsaction.org, that's ROOTS, action.org. At the top, you can sign up. We'll send you action bulletins, and that's very helpful because that strengthens all of us. One more thing. My ebook that was published, reissued in January with a new introduction, is free. And it's a free book online, and it's madelovegotwar.org. That's the title of the book, madelovegotwar.org. And I write about the history of the last 50 years, my own experiences, including in Northern California, and I really invite people to look at that free ebook and tell me what you think.
Wonderful. You know, I want to go back to an article that you wrote for Roots Action. I think it's one of your latest articles on NATO. Could you talk about that article and what you had to say about NATO and as it relates to Putin?
Yes, thank you. You know, I think about when George W. Bush was president and he basically, as Reagan did before, talked about an evil empire and how there's good and evil and good will triumph over evil. There's certainly good in the world, there's certainly evil in the world, but I would say emphatically that it's not often completely clear-cut. And you have nations like the United States that have done tremendous good and tremendous ill and damage to human beings, and yet we're acculturated to choose up sides, the good side and the bad side. And I think it's essential, and at rootsaction.org we've been pointing this out as best we can, it's essential to be very clear that we don't have to choose up sides between militarism. And when you look at the United States invading Iraq, Afghanistan, bombing Libya, just in the last couple of decades, with tremendous loss of life, 900,000 people directly killed by U.S. so-called war on terror, according to the Brown University Costs of War Project, why and how do we get on a high horse and say, we're the beacon of light and good in the world? Whether you want to get biblical about pulling the mote out of your own eye or whatever, we should, as we challenge the evil doing, if you will, of other nations, we need to clean up our own act and get rid of our own madness of militarism, as Dr. King referred to it. That said, what Russia has been doing in Ukraine must be condemned, and also history matters. And the fact that in 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. government under the first President Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, promised that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, and then during the Clinton administration moved not more than 1 inch eastward, moved into almost half a dozen countries up to the Russian border. This was a historic either error or propagation of deception and lie, depending on how you want to look at it. A lot of conservatives like George F. Kennan warned against it at the time, but it's been done. And so the U.S., of course, would never accept a Russian-aligned or previous to that Warsaw Pact, Soviet-aligned alliance to move into Mexico or Canada. It would just absolutely be unacceptable. But somehow our U.S. mass media have encouraged us to believe that it's no, never mind, it's just some sort of paranoia of Russia, that they don't want even this huge, relatively huge compared to other Eastern European countries, very large country of Ukraine absorbed into NATO, and yet that possibility was held open very emphatically. So this is very much a propaganda state where we hear very little about this in the U.S., and it's been an ingredient for this war. Again, it in no way excuses what Russia is doing, but it explains a backstory, and we have to stop U.S.-backed militarism from making the conflagration even worse.
Norman, my friend, what has this this escalation of aggression throughout the world meant for our military budget? I know that Biden is adding to the budget, and as instability in the world grows, as aggression seems to escalate, it seems that defense contractors are getting richer. Is that just my imagination, or is that a thing?
Well, John, I wish it was just your imagination. It's very true, and I'm going to quote someone who, unless you were in the John Birch Society, you really would not say was even a leftist, and that is President Dwight Eisenhower, who said in a speech while he was president, essentially, as he put it, I'm paraphrasing, but very close here, every bomb, every bullet, every tank is in a real sense a theft from the children of the world, those who are unclothed, those who are hungry. It's very, very true. We didn't have the poverty in this country, let alone elsewhere in the world. And yet these budgets continue to go up. The military budget for the Pentagon alone, $767 billion in the current fiscal year. The next proposal is for $813 billion. That doesn't even include nuclear weapons spending for the most part. We're up to $1 trillion a year. We can't even fathom what that is. Much of it is being squandered and wasted and lining the pockets of investors and CEOs who average the big companies $15 or more million dollars a year of personal compensation for their services as military contractor CEOs. This is just, they're making a killing, literally and figuratively, and that is the way the political economy is structured. And it's a theft. If you live in Humboldt County, you live in Mendocino County, elsewhere, anywhere in this country, it's, you drive down the street, you see how our infrastructure has decayed in the last few decades. How many times can we look at the hours of a library and see a public library that's open 7 days a week? It's almost unheard of now. What's happening to community centers, healthcare, education, housing, neonatal care, elder care? This is what militarism does. It depletes our very civility and decency as a society.
Yeah, just to put that in perspective, what our guest Norman Solomon is talking about, our military budget at $813 billion is 12 times more than Russia's military budget. 12 times more. It's the increase in the military budget. I think it's $31 billion increase is twice what Congress spent for COVID aid. That's putting it in perspective. Norman?
It's a crime. It's just a crime at so many levels, and the way to measure it is the United States has 750 military bases overseas. Russia has, at last count, maybe 25.
Mm-hmm. We have about 5 more minutes with you to spend with you, Norman, and I wondered if you would, for one thing, remind our listeners how they can follow your work, but also would you just have a few comments as we go into the midterm elections, and do you think that this conflict in Ukraine and other things will be abused by those running or held against Democrats or whatever? Would you weigh in on that?
Well, I'm very apprehensive about the midterm elections. It won't affect us much here in the very deep blue areas, but in terms of Congress, the Republicans have an excellent chance not only to take over the House, which Pollyanna views, notwithstanding, I think is almost, not totally, but almost a certainty that Republicans will gain the House. People like Kevin McCarthy on track to become majority leader. These are neo-fascist lunatics, as far as I'm concerned, leading the Republican Party. But overall, even the Senate is in jeopardy to fall to the so-called leadership of Mitch McConnell. So we really need to recognize that when you get to November, you do have to choose the lesser of two evils, because that's what's on the table in front of you at that point. In the meantime, we need to get strong progressive candidates nominated. And how the war in Ukraine will be manipulated, as with the COVID crisis, and I think the anti-vaccine movement is a deadly one. I think that even some progressives have been sucked into the right-wing, essentially right-wing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. kind of line against vaccination, which is an anti-public health position. That is going to be exploited as much as possible by the Republican Party. And we are really on thin ice in terms of neo-fascists gaining control of one or both houses of Congress. For people to follow my work, the most important thing I would say in terms of my own articles is that they occasionally appear on commondreams.org. And if you go to commondreams.org, make a habit of that, get their newsletter, and my pieces are listed under opinion, as well as many just excellent articles on a daily basis. Again, I do want to encourage people, please come to us at rootsaction.org. Please be part of our extended organizing family. And lastly, again, to mention something free. It's a free ebook. Made Love Got War is my book, and you can read the whole thing, download it, a beautifully designed PDF at madelovegotwar.org.
Norman, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do, but also the working partnership that station like ours, KMUD, True Community Radio, and shows like ours, Heroes and Patriots, the true working relationship that we have with organizations like root.org and the Institute for Public Accuracy. We hope to get Alfred DeZayas, that is being recommended by the Institute, on our show next, a law professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. How else would we get a guest like that except through your organization? It's an important working partnership that we have with you, and I want to thank you for that. And we'll let you end the show with a pitch for both of our organizations, for our partnership, and as KMUD enters its spring pledge drive, just kick it away. Just kick that pledge drive off, Norman. Thank you.
Well, as the saying goes, you don't miss your water till the well runs dry. You don't want this well to run dry. You don't want to go to the phone,
right,
and say, "Where is KMUD?" You don't want to wonder what happened to KMUD. You want KMUD to be here, and so I'd encourage people to support KMUD.
Thank you, Norman. We've been speaking with Norman Solomon. We hope to have him back as things develop. Please go to rootsaction.org and look at the great work that he and his colleagues are doing.
They are real activists. They're out there. They're doing the real work. And also just go to accuracy.org. They recommend, for those of you doing guerrilla radio out there on online and in blogs, you can get great ideas for shows, suggestions for guests. This is true and very true alternative media, true independent media, not corporate media, and just as Norman suggests, essential, like water from the well. Essential.
Excuse me, John. Thank you for listening. Our next show will be May 5th, where we will feature Katrina Vanden Heuvel, which she will be a returning guest, so don't miss that. That's May 5th from 9 to 10 a.m. on a Thursday. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Norman.
Thanks.